I ran my father's business for 6 years, then he gave it to my brother instead. I sacrificed everything, worked harder than anyone, and proved my worth, but it was never enough. The moment my golden child brother came back, my father handed him everything I built. So I walked away, cut them all off, and now? Their business is crumbling, their family is broken, and I'm finally free. My dad always had one grand vision, passing down his business like a family heirloom. To him, it wasn't just a company or a way to make money. It was his pride, his identity, something meant to last through generations. From the moment my older brother, Alex, and I were born, he made it clear that we were expected to follow in his footsteps. There were no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This was our destiny. It didn't matter what dreams we had for ourselves. Our future had already been written. As the youngest, I looked up to my dad, admired his work ethic, and genuinely wanted to make him proud. I believed that stepping into his shoes was the right thing to do. Summers weren't about vacations or lazy afternoons by the pool like they were for other kids. Instead, they were filled with long hours at my dad's business. He made sure Alex and I were involved in everything. Interning, running errands, handling small tasks, and even doing the most mundane jobs like sorting files or cleaning inventory. He believed in hands-on learning, that the only way to prepare us for the future was to immerse us in it early. Work ethic, discipline, resilience, he drilled these values into us day after day, shaping us into the business leaders he wanted us to be. When Alex finally graduated from college, my parents were ecstatic. In their minds, this was the next step toward securing the family legacy. We had all expected him to return home, to take his rightful place in the business. But instead, he shocked everyone, especially my dad, by announcing that he had accepted a job in a city far away, working at some IT company. Worse, he was moving there with his girlfriend, who had also found a job in the same city. My parents were devastated. My dad, in particular, was furious, taking Alex's decision as a personal betrayal. He ranted for days, pacing around the house, fists clenched, shouting that Alex was no longer his son. It wasn't just about the business, it was about rejecting everything my dad had built, everything he stood for. My mom, unable to accept that her golden boy would make such a decision on his own, placed all the blame on his girlfriend. In her mind, it had to be her manipulative influence that led Alex astray. If it weren't for that girl, he would have come back home, taken his rightful place, and made our dad proud. They tried everything to make him change his mind. Guilt-tripping, begging, yelling, but Alex stood firm. After weeks of endless arguments, he made the ultimate decision. He cut them off completely. No calls, no texts, no contact. It was like he had vanished from our lives. My parents spiraled. One moment they were grieving their lost son. The next they were burning with anger. But with Alex gone, there was only one person left to carry on the family name. That person was me. The day Alex announced he wasn't coming back was the day everything changed in our house. My father had built his whole life around the idea that one day, his sons would take over his business, so when Alex rejected that future, it was like watching a dam break. My parents were in complete shock at first, sitting at the dinner table in stunned silence as Alex explained his decision. He talked about his IT job, how excited he was about moving, and how this was the right path for him. He genuinely believed they would be happy for him, or at the very least accept his choice. But the second he finished speaking, my dad exploded. "You're turning your back on everything I built?" His voice thundered through the house, the anger in his eyes burning hotter than I had ever seen before. "After everything I've done for you? You're my firstborn. My son. You're supposed to take this over one day." My mom sat there with wide eyes, gripping the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Then she did what she always did when something didn't make sense to her. She blamed someone else. "This is her fault, isn't it?" She spat, her voice dripping with venom. "That girlfriend of yours. She put these ideas in your head. She's taking you away from us." Alex looked exhausted, like he had been preparing for this battle for weeks but was still overwhelmed by the weight of it. "No one put any ideas in my head," he said, his tone surprisingly calm despite the chaos around him. "This is my choice. I don't want to run a business, Dad. I never did." The words stung, even though they weren't directed at me. My dad had always treated the business like it was the most sacred thing in our family, and for Alex to reject it outright was worse than an insult. It was a betrayal. My father stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. My mom, on the other hand, refused to accept it. She spent the next few days calling Alex nonstop, sending guilt-ridden texts about how he was tearing the family apart, how Dad wasn't eating or sleeping, how she was afraid this would kill him. But Alex refused to budge. The more they pushed, the more distant he became. Until finally, one day he was just gone. No calls. No messages. Nothing. My parents were devastated. My dad went from screaming about how Alex was no longer his son to sitting in silence for hours, staring at nothing. My mom cried herself to sleep most nights, muttering about how his girlfriend had poisoned his mind. But underneath the grief, there was something else, something sharper, darker. Resentment. And it had nowhere to go but toward me. With Alex gone, my father zeroed in on me like a laser. "You won't betray me the way he did," he said one night, looking me dead in the eyes. "You're different. You understand the importance of family." He had already made up his mind. I was going to take Alex's place, whether I wanted to or not. After Alex cut ties with the family, my dad shifted all his attention and his expectations onto me. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a question. It was a command. I was going to be his heir. There was no room for debate. He couldn't have the perfect son, so he would make do with what he had. And what he had was me. For context, I'm a woman. But to my father, that was just an unfortunate biological inconvenience, something to be corrected rather than accepted. From the moment he decided I would take over, he stopped treating me like his daughter and started treating me like the son he wished I was. "You're not like other girls," he would say, his tone always filled with something that sounded like pride. "You're strong. You don't waste time on stupid things like makeup or dresses. That's why I know you won't let me down." I had never actually agreed to any of this, but that didn't matter to him. My fate had been decided. At first, I didn't mind. If anything, a part of me felt honored. He chose me. Not Alex, not anyone else, me. It felt like a validation of my intelligence, my abilities, my hard work. If my father believed in me enough to entrust me with his business, then maybe this was where I was meant to be. But admiration quickly turned into suffocation. Little by little, he stripped away everything that made me me. I was discouraged, no, forbidden from wearing anything remotely feminine. Dresses? Absolutely not. Makeup? Unacceptable. Long hair? It's impractical. You'll look more professional with it short. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. When I protested, he would dismiss it with a wave of his hand. "You want people to take you seriously in business? Then stop acting like a little girl." I tried to justify it at first. Maybe he was right. Maybe appearance mattered. Maybe this was what it took to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry. But it wasn't just about clothes or hair. It was control. Every decision about my life, my future, my identity, he dictated it all. And I let him. Because I wanted his approval. Because I thought that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, then one day he would see me as worthy. When I graduated college with a business degree, I had already been groomed into his perfect heir. I had spent years learning the ins and outs of the business, working harder than anyone, proving my worth in every possible way. And yet, when I landed a fantastic job offer on my own, outside of my father's company, he wouldn't even let me consider it. "You don't need to work for anyone else. You have a business right here," he said, his tone firm, final. "Why would you waste your time building someone else's empire when you should be focused on ours?" And just like that, the decision was made for me. I gave up my dream job and stepped into the life he had forced upon me. I had no idea that I was walking straight into a trap, one that would consume years of my life, crush my spirit, and in the end, leave me with absolutely nothing. Taking over the business wasn't just a job, it was a full-blown submission to my father's world. From the moment I stepped in, my life stopped belonging to me. Every morning started early, with barely enough time to breathe before I was thrown into a relentless cycle of meetings, client negotiations, and overseeing operations. My father was a workaholic, and under his rule, I had no choice but to become one too. He expected perfection. Every detail, every decision, every single move I made had to be flawless. If I made a mistake, even a small one, he would humiliate me in front of the employees. "You think this is acceptable?" he'd snap, slamming papers onto my desk. "You want to be in charge, but you can't even get this right?" There was never any encouragement, never a good job or "I'm proud of you." The only feedback I ever got was criticism. For 6 years, I ran that business like it was my own, but it was never truly mine. I had no autonomy. Every decision had to go through my father first, and if he disagreed, it didn't matter how much research or logic I presented, his word was law. Yet, ironically, when things went right, he took all the credit. If a deal was secured, it was because of his reputation. If the business grew, it was because of his leadership. But if something went wrong, that was my fault. I gave up everything for that company. Friendships faded because I never had time to see anyone. Dating? Impossible. My entire existence revolved around work. My father had successfully molded me into the perfect business heir, but at what cost? I had no life outside of those office walls. No dreams, no relationships, no identity of my own. And yet, I still believed it would all be worth it. That one day he would finally acknowledge my effort. That he would look at me and say, "You've earned this." But that day never came. Because in his eyes, I was never meant to inherit anything. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, I was still just his daughter. And that meant I would always be second choice. I just didn't realize it until my brother came back. One evening, out of nowhere, Alex showed up on our doorstep. It had been years since he cut ties with us, and yet there he was, tired, defeated, and carrying nothing but a duffel bag. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, unsure of what to feel. He had walked away without looking back, leaving me to clean up the mess. And now, after all these years, he was back. My parents reacted as if Jesus himself had returned. The second my mother saw him, she burst into tears, throwing her arms around him like he'd been kidnapped and finally rescued. My father, who had once raged about how Alex was dead to him, softened in an instant. "You're home," he said, gripping Alex's shoulder like some prodigal hero had finally returned. Alex didn't even try to pretend like he was here for sentimental reasons. He laid it all out. His company had downsized, and he had been laid off. His girlfriend, the same one my mom had blamed for everything, had dumped him the moment he lost his job. With no money, no place to live, and no future, he had come back because he had nowhere else to go. I sat there, watching it all unfold, waiting for my father's usual harshness. Waiting for the same disappointment, the same anger, the same endless lectures I had been subjected to for years. But it never came. Instead, my dad, the man who had screamed that Alex was no longer his son, welcomed him back with open arms. It was as if none of it had ever happened. "Don't worry about anything," Dad assured him. "You're back where you belong. You'll take your rightful place in the business." I nearly choked on my drink. His rightful place? Excuse me? I had been running that business for 6 years, dedicating every ounce of my energy to keeping it alive, while Alex had been off living his life. And now, just like that, my father was handing everything to him on a silver platter. Alex, for his part, didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable about it. If anything, he looked relieved. He nodded along as my dad mapped out how he'd be joining the company, how he'd learn everything in time, how this was always meant to be. He didn't question it. He didn't say, "But Dad, she has been running the business all these years." He didn't acknowledge my efforts at all. Instead, he sat back and let it happen. And just like that, I realized the truth I had been too blind to see for years. It was never about who worked harder. It was never about who deserved it. It was always about the fact that I was never, ever going to be good enough in my father's eyes. Because I wasn't his son. It happened faster than I could process. One day, I was running the business like I always had, drowning in work while Alex tagged along, clueless and lazy. The next, my father announced his retirement, and with it, the decision that shattered everything I had worked for. We had gathered in the office, the same boardroom where I had spent years negotiating deals, handling crises, and making sure the company didn't fall apart. I had always assumed that when my father finally stepped down, this moment would be mine. That he would look at me and say, "You've earned this. Take it to the next level." Instead, he turned to Alex. "I've decided," he said, with that same unshakable authority he always carried. "Alex will be taking over as the new head of the company." I froze. My stomach dropped. My mind barely registered the words. I had known my father still held outdated beliefs. I had always felt like I was fighting against invisible expectations. But this was blatant. I had given him 6 years of my life. I had built relationships with clients, managed employees, kept the business growing while he loomed over me with impossible expectations. I had sacrificed everything for this company. And yet, none of it mattered. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief, "Alex has been back for 4 months. He doesn't know anything about this business. He can't even explain what we do properly. How can you think he's ready to take your place?" My father's expression didn't change. He barely even acknowledged my words. Instead, he answered like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's where you come in. You'll help him adjust. You'll keep things running smoothly while he learns. While he learns. While he learns. I wanted to scream. For 6 years I had been expected to be perfect, flawless, tireless. I had been criticized for every mistake, pressured into absolute perfection. And now suddenly mistakes were okay? Suddenly it was fine for someone to learn as they go? Because that someone was a man. You can't be serious, I whispered, my voice barely holding back the rage boiling inside me. You're giving him everything I've worked for. Everything I've earned. Just like that. My father actually sighed, like I was being difficult. Alex is the man of the family, he said, as if that explained everything. This business is his responsibility. That was it. That was the reason. Not hard work. Not dedication. Not the fact that I had been running things for years. I was furious, shaking with anger, betrayal clawing at my chest. But the worst part? Alex didn't even try to fight it. He just sat there, accepting it like it was his birthright. No hesitation. No guilt. Just smug, entitled confidence. You're the youngest, he said with a shrug, like I was some brat throwing a tantrum over a toy. This was always going to be my responsibility. Responsibility? Responsibility? The only reason he was sitting there, about to inherit everything I worked for, was because he had the right chromosomes. I had spent my entire life trying to prove to my father that I was worthy, that I could handle anything, that I deserved this. But in the end, I never even had a chance. I didn't go back to work the next day, or the day after that. I couldn't. The betrayal was too much. I had given everything to that business, to my father, and it had all been for nothing. My entire world felt like it had collapsed in an instant, and I didn't know how to function. For the first time in years, I had no structure, no routine, no endless meetings or responsibilities keeping me busy. And instead of feeling free, I felt completely and utterly lost. The rage, the heartbreak, the exhaustion, I drowned in it. I barely left my apartment. I ignored calls from my father, from my mother, from Alex. I didn't want to hear their excuses, their justifications, their pathetic attempts to act like everything was fine. Because it wasn't fine. It would never be fine. I started drinking, not because I enjoyed it, but because it was the only thing that dulled the overwhelming sense of worthlessness that had taken root inside me. I had spent my entire life chasing my father's approval, bending over backward, proving myself in every way possible, only to be cast aside without a second thought. It made me question everything. If this didn't matter, if years of sacrifice didn't mean anything, then what was the point? What was I even worth? The worst part was that my parents didn't even see my pain as valid. They dismissed it completely, acting like I was being childish for taking things so personally. It's the right decision, they told me, over and over again, as if repeating it would make it true. My father even had the audacity to say, clients might not feel comfortable with a woman running the business. You should understand that. Understand what? That I was never going to be good enough in his eyes? That I was just a temporary placeholder until his real heir came back? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that no matter what I did, I would never win. There was no amount of hard work, no level of dedication, no sacrifice that would ever make me more than just a woman in my father's eyes. And if that was the case, if I was always going to be second place, then why the hell was I still here? Why was I still breaking myself for people who would never appreciate it? I was done. Done fighting, done trying, done caring. I packed my things, withdrew every bit of money I had earned, and left. No explanation, no dramatic goodbye, just gone. My father didn't deserve one. My mother didn't deserve one. None of them did. If they wanted Alex to run the business so badly, they could have him. I was done trying to be something they would never accept. I walked away from the business, from my family, from everything that had defined my life for so long, and for the first time in years I was free. It's been almost a year since I left, and I can confidently say it was the best decision I've ever made. At first, it was terrifying walking away from everything I had ever known, from the business I had poured my soul into, from the only life I had ever been allowed to have. But as the months passed, I started to realize something. I wasn't losing anything. I was finally living. For the first time in years, I wake up without the crushing weight of expectations suffocating me. There's no father hovering over me, no endless cycle of proving myself only to be dismissed. There's no pressure to be someone I'm not, no constant battle for approval I will never get. I got a job, not in my father's business, not in some legacy I was forced into, but in something I actually chose. It's not as prestigious, not as high pressure, but it makes me happy. I can breathe. I can sleep. I can exist without feeling like I'm failing at something every second of the day. I let my hair grow out, wear whatever I want, paint my nails if I feel like it. Small things that I never realized meant so much until I was finally free to do them without hearing my father's voice in the back of my head telling me it was a waste of time. I've also started therapy, slowly undoing years of conditioning that made me believe my worth was tied to how much I could endure. And I've made friends, real friends, ones who see me for who I am, not just for what I can do for them. On top of that, I met someone. His name is John, and he's kind, patient, and everything my father never was. He doesn't see me as something to control, something to mold into his expectations. He loves me as I am, not for what I can achieve, not for how much I sacrifice, just for me. It's a strange feeling, being truly accepted, and for a while I didn't know how to handle it. But I'm learning. I'm learning that I don't need to be perfect to be valued, that I don't need to break myself to be worthy of love, that I was never the problem, it was them. I thought leaving would feel like running away, but it doesn't. It feels like freedom. Yesterday my father called me. I didn't answer. I didn't even think about it. Ever since the day I walked away, my parents had kept their word, they hadn't contacted me. The only messages I ever got were from Alex, usually guilt-tripping texts about how hard it was for him to handle the business alone, how I had abandoned the family, how our parents were heartbroken over what I had done. I never replied. But when my father's number popped up on my screen, I just stared at it, waiting for it to stop ringing. And then early this morning, my doorbell rang. Still groggy, I opened it, and there he was, my father, standing in front of me for the first time in almost a year. He looked different. Older. Smaller. The man who had once towered over me with authority, who had dictated every aspect of my life, now looked tired. Weak. But his voice was still the same, firm, direct, straight to the point. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, but I let him in. We sat down, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't nervous about what he would say. He wasted no time, no small talk, no apologies. He was here for one reason only. "I need you to come back," he said. "The business needs you. I let you rebel for long enough, but now it's time to stop playing around and take responsibility for your family." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. After everything, after the way he treated me, he had the audacity to show up here and act like it was my duty to clean up his mess? I laughed, an actual laugh, sharp and bitter. "No," I said simply, leaning back in my chair. "I'm not coming back. And this isn't me rebelling. This is my life now. I don't care what happens to the family business." He blinked, clearly caught off guard by my casual dismissal. I had never spoken to him like this before. But that was before I learned that I didn't need his approval, before I realized that nothing I did would ever be enough for him. His voice hardened as he launched into a rant about Alex, admitting outright that my brother was failing. The business was suffering because Alex lacked leadership, lacked charisma, lacked the ability to command respect from clients. He blamed Alex for being too much like my mother, too soft, too quiet, too incapable of handling pressure. The irony was almost laughable. He had chosen Alex. He had thrown me aside for Alex. And now he was sitting here, acting like I should feel bad for his mistake. "If that's the case," I said, raising an eyebrow, "why didn't you give me the business instead of him last year? You knew I worked harder. You knew I was the one who actually knew how to run everything." His answer was exactly what I expected, cold, unapologetic, and as misogynistic as ever. "Because you're a girl," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "What I built, it means something. I couldn't just leave it to you." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. I had already known the answer. I just wanted to hear him say it out loud. I wanted him to admit it. So just because I was a woman, he refused to give me what I had worked for? But now that his precious son had let him down, suddenly I was worth considering again. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You didn't respect me enough to run your business. You didn't think I was worthy of the legacy you built. But now that Alex is screwing up, you want me to come back and fix everything for you." My father, still unwilling to see the weight of his own actions, simply nodded. "You're more like me than Alex ever was. I see that now. I made a mistake, but you need to come back and make things right." And then, as if he could sense I wasn't moved, he pulled out the only card he had left. "I can't give you the business," he admitted, his voice matter of fact. "But I'll pay you. A very high salary. More than anyone else there. That's the best I can do." My father, the man who had stolen years of my life, who had disregarded my worth, who had never once acknowledged my sacrifices, was trying to buy me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, then looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not your backup plan," I said, my voice unwavering. "You made your choice. You have to live with it. I don't care what happens to your business. I don't care what happens to Alex. I don't care about any of it. I spent 6 years breaking myself for you, and it got me nothing. Now I finally have a life of my own, a life where I'm happy. And I'm not giving that up for you." His face twisted with anger, but I didn't flinch. "I want you to leave," I said firmly. "And don't ever come back." He hesitated, like he still couldn't believe I was saying no. Like he still thought he could convince me. But I was done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood up. He walked to the door, pausing for a brief moment before turning to look at me one last time. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "You're turning your back on your family." I smiled, actually smiled. "No," I said, "I'm finally choosing myself." And with that, I shut the door in his face. A few days after my father showed up at my door, my mother called me. I ignored it, just like I had ignored every other attempt at contact. But then she kept calling again and again, until finally, curiosity got the better of me. I answered, expecting another lecture, another guilt trip, another desperate plea for me to return and fix everything. But what I got instead was something I never expected. She was crying. Not the usual manipulative, guilt-inducing sobs, this was different. She sounded shaken, exhausted, like someone whose world had just crumbled beneath her feet. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice raw. "Please just listen." I didn't say anything, just let her speak. And then she told me everything. After my father's visit, things at home fell apart. My brother, the golden child, the chosen heir, the son who was supposed to uphold the family legacy, finally snapped. Apparently, the pressure of running the business had been crushing him. Clients didn't trust him. Employees didn't respect him. He made mistake after mistake, and no matter how much my father covered for him, it was obvious he wasn't capable of leading. My father, who had always believed Alex would rise to the occasion, started blaming him for every single failure. The constant criticism, the disappointment, the way my father tore into him the same way he had always torn into me, it finally broke him. My mother told me that after months of fights, after watching my father shred his confidence to pieces, Alex made a decision. He was leaving. He told my father he was done with the business, that he didn't care what happened to it. He packed his bags and walked out, just like I had. That was when my mother's voice cracked the most, when she admitted what happened next. She left too. She said that after everything, after watching my father humiliate both of his children, after hearing him rant about how he never wanted a daughter, and how Alex had turned out to be too weak to carry the family name, she finally saw him for what he was. She told me she had spent years defending him, making excuses for his behavior, blaming other people for his mistakes. But when she saw how easily he discarded both of us, how he treated us like objects instead of his own children, she realized something. She had wasted her entire life enabling a man who never truly loved anyone but himself. So she did the one thing I never thought she would do. She left him. She packed her things, took what money she could, and told him she was done. He raged, screamed at her, insulted her, told her she was being hysterical. But she didn't care. "I should have left years ago," she admitted, and for the first time in my life, I actually believed her. Now my father is alone. The business is failing. His son has abandoned him. His wife has walked out. And the daughter he never valued, the one person who could have saved him, has shut the door on him forever. "Are you happy now?" my mother asked me, her voice almost bitter. I thought about that for a moment. Was I happy? No. Happiness isn't the right word. Satisfied? Yes. Vindicated? Absolutely. "I don't feel bad for him," I said. "He did this to himself." She sighed, like she already knew that would be my answer. And then after a long pause she said, "I'm sorry." It was the first time she had ever said those words to me. And maybe once I would have clung to them, taken them as a sign that I still had family left, that there was something worth salvaging. But I had already spent too many years waiting for them to change. She wanted me to unblock her. She wanted to talk. Maybe even rebuild something. But I don't owe her that. I don't owe any of them anything. So I told her, "I'm glad you left. But I don't think we have anything more to talk about." And then I hung up. I blocked her number. I blocked Alex's too. They can figure out their own lives now. As for my father, he'll watch everything he built collapse around him, and there won't be a single person left to help him pick up the pieces. That's not my problem anymore.